Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be considering whether there's a danger in a piece of music of using too many non-chord tones, or you might know non-chord tones as inessential notes. We tend to call them inessential notes in the UK, in the US, tend to be known as non-chord tones, and then various parts of the world belong to one or more of those camps, but they're basically the same thing. So before we have any confusion about non-chord tones or inessential notes, they're the same thing. Well, is there a danger? I suppose there is. See, some people end up harmonizing something in a rather syllabic way where they're a bit frightened of using non-chord tones or inessential notes. So you just get a bit of harmony that kind of goes from one chord to the next, and maybe the chords are absolutely fine, but it's a bit tedious and a bit syllabic because you're just going from one chord to the next without anything that's going to help improve the flow or the interest of that. So one way in which we can mitigate that is to use these inessential notes or non-chord tones. So there are things called passing notes or passing tones when you're literally moving by step, so that maybe you start on a G and you're moving to a B, but you slip an A in between. So if you're going to go G, A, B, well, the A is just one of those passing notes or passing tones. So you see that A doesn't belong to the chord. It's dissonant, but it's just passing by step. But it makes it more interesting than just doing this. So if you have a little passing note or a passing tone there, that's nice. Or you could even do it in the tenor part. Or you could even do it in both and have double passing notes or double passing tones. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Just adds a bit of colour, bit of movement to the whole thing, makes it kind of possibly more expressive as well. Or you can use neighbour tones, or what we call auxiliary notes. So if I've got this chorded G major and I've got a G in a melody, I can hop up a note and back again. So when I go from G to A to G, that A doesn't belong to the chord. Sounds a bit kind of clashy, doesn't it? But it's just a temporary budge up a note and back. So that's an upper neighbour tone or an upper auxiliary note. Or I could use one going down a note and back. So a lower neighbour tone or a lower auxiliary note. So these are kind of useful things. But one danger is that we're a bit frightened of using them, so we do that slightly boring syllabic thing. The opposite danger is, like anything else in life, that when we discover about these things, we go a bit crazy and we start kind of overdoing it. So just looking at the bit of music that I've got in front of me, here's a bit of music where you might think that I've got too many non-chord tones or inessential notes. Now, just looking at the score, the minute you look at all this stuff, you think, oh my goodness, what is going on here? You know, I've got all these semiquavers, 16th notes, I've got demi-semiquavers, 32nd notes, and it's all looking a bit crazy because, you know, I've got this tune going along at the top, and then what are all these notes here? Well, what I've purposely done here is to use what I would be considering too many of these non-chord tones or inessential notes, but they're all perfectly legal, all perfectly acceptable. But let's think about, well, what's going on here? And then let's think about, well, why is that maybe a step too far? One thing I should say is a great deal depends on the tempo. If you're going slowly, you can afford to have more of this kind of decoration. If you're going fast, it gets a bit bonkers. So, you know, we should hear what I've got here. But if I was to go quite slowly, you might think, oh, it's not too bad. You know, if that's going reasonably slowly, it doesn't sound too bad. It still sounds a bit hectic, doesn't it? The minute we're going faster, you sort of think, what's going on there? There's just notes flying all over the place, you know, so it gets a bit bonkers. So we've got to make a decision about the original melody, haven't we? Because we might decide that we're not even trying to harmonize every single one of these quavers or eighth notes. You know, we could think, well, I'll harmonize this note. This could be a passing note or a passing tone. I'll harmonize this note. This could be a passing note or a passing tone. I could harmonize this note. This could be an upper auxiliary note or an upper neighbor tone going back to the chord tone or the harmony note. This could be a passing note or a passing tone. So in fact, it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. One thing that's happened in this harmonization that I've put together is that I'm treating every single melody note as sort of something to do with harmony, really. So it's kind of like making for a fast harmonic rhythm anyway, because we're moving all the time. You know, those first four notes, you know, you could think, well, I could just have a chord of G major. That would be much simpler, wouldn't it? You know, if you were Mozart, you might well have done that. Or even two chords, maybe one chord here, another one here, and back to the first one. So, you know, you can do this in a very simple way. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated. But in this version, I've got a chord there, a G major chord here. Now, you could say, well, this is a chord in its own right. It's a kind of 7/7 chord. Or you could say, well, not really, because that is an upper auxiliary note or an upper neighbor tone, because I'm going from D to D and I've just got the note above in between. You could say this is a passing note or a passing tone between this B and this D. You could say this is a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbor tone. One of the interesting things about this that you've already kind of probably rumbled is, well, actually, we're now a bit confused, aren't we? Is this a separate chord, like an F sharp A, C, E chord, a 7/7 chord? Or is it really just that we're using a tonic chord here and we've got three inessential notes going on there, in addition to another one that's already happening in the melody, because that could be seen as a passing note or a passing tone. The point about this, of course, is that if all of the parts are using non-chord tones or inessential notes, we begin to wonder, is this a new chord, or are we just using, you know, a multitude of non-chord tones? That might be saying to us, actually, if you're in four parts, is it a good idea to have inessential notes or non-chord tones in all four parts at the same time? Or is it a good idea to have something that we can hang on to that says, yeah, we're using maybe two passing notes or passing tones, or maybe we're using an auxiliary note, a neighbor tone, but we're not trying to do a whole heap of things in the same place, so every single part is moving, so we don't know if we're listening to a chord or a whole load of non-chord tones. So that's the first point I'm making. You can look at this immediately and think that looks a bit too busy. You might look at that alongside it and say, oh, that looks okay. But actually, the first thing I'm flagging up is that here, if you've got all four parts doing something that may be non-chord tones or inessential notes, it's a bit difficult to kind of hear the wood for the trees, isn't it? Well, when we go on to the next chord, well, life, you know, returns to something a bit more sane, because all these notes belong to the tonic chord. So that's all fine, isn't it? I go on to the next chord, and what have I got there? Well, that's another chord. It's a new harmony, isn't it? This is a chord 4, and I've just put it in first inversion this time. But actually, the harmonic rhythm, even in these first 4 notes, is quite fast, because I'm sort of hearing chord, 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 or I'm hearing chord, a whole heap of inessential notes, chord, chord. Either way, it's not terribly happy, is it? There's too much congestion. Okay, so even though the rhythm isn't doing anything like the mad stuff that the rhythm's doing here, it's still over congested for the reasons that we've talked about. Right, now let's move on to the second half of this measure, this bar, where this complete madness takes off. Now, really what's happening here is we're starting on a chord 5. Okay, well, that's all right because that's D, F sharp, A. So I've got D, F sharp, A with another D in the bass. So what's going on? Well, this G in the alto is an upper auxiliary or an upper neighbour tone. I've also got one of those in the tenor. And I've also got one of them in the bass, but this is a lower one. So do you see what's happening here? Well, I've got an upper in the alto, an upper in the tenor, and a lower in the bass. So I've got, well, it doesn't sound horribly wrong, does it? It's going pretty fast if I do that. And then I've got to go. So rhythmically, it suddenly sounds completely manic, doesn't it? Does it sound like a subtle decoration, or does it sound like a burst of machine gun fire? You know, because if it's the latter, it's not really going to work, is it? Think about inessential notes or non-chord tones as subtle decorations of the music, things that add interest. And then you won't go too far wrong. But again here, the soprano part is sitting on that D, but the other three parts have suddenly gone crazy with these neighbour tones or auxiliary notes. And so it's no longer subtle. The rhythm is too fast and there's too much going on. And we've got uppers and lowers and oh, goodness me. So it's probably worth just thinking, actually, have I got time to deliver all of that in the space of one quaver, 1/8 note? And can I kind of multiply all that by 3? Probably not. You know, it's like when you go into somebody's room and you see a little ornament on the mantelpiece that you don't particularly notice when you first go into the room. And when you've been sitting there for a while, you think, oh, that's rather nice, isn't it? It really kind of sets off that mantelpiece. I didn't even notice it when I came in. That's subtle, isn't it? But when you go and visit somebody who's just been on holiday to Benidorm or Florida or somewhere, and they've come back with one of those huge kind of blow up pink elephants or something, and they've stuck it right in the middle of their lounge, well, it's the first thing you notice when you walk in, isn't it? You walk in and you think, crikey, what's that? You know, it's too much. Well, this is the musical equivalent of the blow up pink elephant. All due respect to anybody who loves holidays in Benidorm or Florida. Lovely places, enjoy, but think twice about the pink elephant. Anyway, there you go. So this is the musical equivalent of that. Okay, well, when we go on to the next thing, the next quaver or the next 8th note, well, I've got a chord 4 going on here. And one thing is, you might say, well, do I need to change the chord on every single quaver? That's the discussion we've been having. Well, you don't, because as we said, the E in the soprano could just be an upper auxiliary note, an upper neighbour tone. But if you think, yeah, I'll change the chord, well, bear in mind that the harmonic rhythm, the rate of chord change, is already fast. So do we need to congest it with anything else? Well, one slight improvement this time is that at least the bass is stopping around for a moment. So that's slightly better than the previous note we had. But what have we got going on here? Well, we've got an upper auxiliary note or an upper neighbour tone going on in this alto part. In the tenor, we've got another non-chord tone or inessential note called an anticipatory note. So it's moved down from the C to the B, and the B repeats as we go over that moment there. So, you know, okay, it's perfectly reasonable. You know, we can justify the existence of these things. Question is, do you want all that going on in just that tiny space? We move on to the next note, and, you know, what's going on here really? Well, effectively, because the bass is now on the move, you know, you can say that this C is a lower auxiliary note or a lower neighbour tone. But there's also a sense in which kind of we've got one chord there, we've got another chord there, because in the tenor, well, this belongs to a G major chord. This A is a passing note or a passing tone. This G doesn't really belong to this chord, but it could belong to a chord here before we go on to an upper neighbour tone or an upper auxiliary note, you know, before we come back to the next harmony note. So that's all a bit crazy, isn't it? And then in the alto, we've kind of got the same thing going on. We've got this passing note here, passing tone. This E, well, it's kind of helping to create a new chord 4 here, isn't it? And then an upper neighbour tone or an upper auxiliary before we come back to some harmony there. So even though we've only got this quaver, this 8th note, we've kind of started there and then sort of resolved that and then gone on to another chord. It's all far too congested, and we're not quite sure, are we hearing changes in harmony, or are we just hearing a load of congestion with these inessential notes on non-chord tones? You see what's happening? It's over congesting the music. It's causing confusion galore. Okay, then we move on to the next thing. Well, you know, we've got this C in the melody. The bass is getting busy because I thought, oh, it'd be rather nice to have a little run up to G. So you can kind of do that, can't you? Sort of treating it as a kind of two passing notes next to each other. You know, that's not impossible. One of them can be accented, one could be unaccented. That's absolutely fine. I've got this sort of a chape pattern going on in the alto and the tenor, you know, when a part hops a third and then steps back inside the leap of the third. So we've kind of got one of those going on, and then we're thinking, well, what is the chord? Because that's an interesting chord that's sort of resolving in the second half of the beat. So there's almost two chord movements going on there. Sounds nice. At the same time as the bass then goes into that passing note, and then we're thinking, oh, is this a new chord or what? You know, it's not clear. It's so congested, we're not entirely clear which are chord movements, which are decorations. Hopefully you get the idea. The point of this is we can justify every single one of those notes in that little extract that I've written here as harmony notes, chord tones, or as inessential notes. But the musical outcome just leaves you feeling, you know, rather assaulted by too many notes. Okay, well, here's another version of exactly the same melody, and it immediately looks totally different, doesn't it? So I'm using some inessential notes or some non-chord tones, but nothing like in the manic way of the previous example. Let me play you this version. Now, that sounds so much more sensible, doesn't it? Let's have a quick look at what's going on. I've used a chord 1 here, and then I'm using a 6, then a 5, then a 5 in first inversion, then a 1. So the first thing is you can see exactly what's going on in the harmony, and you can hear it nice and clearly. You hear chord, 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 chord. You even hear that in the second half of this bar, we're using the same chord twice. All we're doing is changing the inversion. Has it got enough interest within essential notes or non-chord tones? Well, the soprano is treating that as a passing note, as a passing tone, and there's another one there. We are treating this as an upper auxiliary or an upper neighbour tone. We are treating this as a passing note or a passing tone. This is an interesting one and a good one to use because this is chord 5, and that passing note or passing tone makes the 5 richer by turning it into a 5/7. So it's a passing note or a passing tone that happens to turn 5 into 5/7. Always a good thing to do. Elsewhere, some of the time I'm just thinking, you know what, we'll just have harmony notes or chord tones without anything fancy extra going on. But every now and again, well, there's a passing note in the bass. So that little passing tone, there's a nice way of connecting up the third that you've got between the G and the E. You know, I could do the same thing again here. I'm choosing not to because if I put an E in there, I would have octaves with the soprano, so that wouldn't be a good idea. But at this point, I've got F sharp to A in the alto, so I am using a passing note or a passing tone at that point in the alto. It's also making it more interesting. I've got passing note in the bass, passing note in the alto in a different part. So one happening in the first half of that measure and one happening in the second half of that same measure or the same bar. There's contramotion. It's even a little bit contrapuntal. There are 3 notes going down or 3 notes going up. And it doesn't overshadow the melody. It supports the melody, makes life a bit more interesting. You could do more than I've written here. It's up to you. I mean, you could decide, for example, as you come into this last chord, well, I'll have a suspension in the alto, have a 9/8 suspension that goes A, G. So you do something like this. nice thing to do, just to add even more colour to it. But you see, this sounds quite sensible. If it's going reasonably slowly, it works. But you could maybe ornament it a little bit more because it's going slowly. If it's going quite quickly, it works. And you probably don't want to put any more into that because it will get cluttered again. So, you know, is there a rule anywhere that says this is the maximum number of inessential notes or non-chord tones you can use? Absolutely not. You've got to make a musical judgment on it. That will be partly about style and period. It will be partly about justifying the inessential notes you're using. It will be partly something to do with tempo as well. So bear those things in mind and then try to make a sensible decision about it so that, you know, it's adding to the expression of the music without destroying the expression because it's got too manic and too congested. And think about the fact that often you're supporting a melodic line, and if you've got too much going on underneath it or above it, we destroy the kind of ability of the human ear to focus on that melodic line. So those are the deciders that will hopefully help you to make the right call on the balance. So don't underuse, don't overdose, and you'll be away. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. And if you're really wanting to do a bit more work on the stuff we've been doing here today, well, if you click on courses when you get to the home page, you can find our keyboard harmony course, which is really kind of taking you through keyboard harmony, literally harmony under your fingers. And as part of that course, we spend a bit of time doing all this stuff with inessential notes and non-chord tones. So you learn the harmonic language of the diatonic chords, you learn the chromatic chords, you also learn how to use these things so that you get fluent at it under your fingers. That will also help you to write harmony and to hear harmony. So that's a really kind of liberating course. Many people who've done that course have told us how it's been an absolute life changer because they've read all this stuff in books, but somehow never quite related to it in sound or been able to think of it under their fingers, and that's the course that's really helped them. So have a look at that and many other courses and links to our Maestros groups if you're interested in that as well. Lots there anyway. www.mmcourses.co.uk.